Welcome to the plenary lecture by Dr. Michael Soule. My name is Joel Berger, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Soule. And Michael is very affectionately known as the father of conservation biology. A couple of words about Michael. He's had a very remarkable career across a lot of continents, across time and space, and most importantly, on impact. Michael grew up in Southern California, canyons of San Diego, hunting, fishing, collecting reptiles, herps, watching birds, looking at mammals. And Michael went to San Diego State University. From there, he went on to Stanford, studied under Paul Ehrlich, focused on population genetics and evolutionary biology. Michael, from there, went on to help establish the first university in Malawi. He's made some seminal contributions about park size, population and species persistence, isolation and fragmentation, and jumped onto the conservation scene with publications in that arena as well as in population genetics. Michael has done fieldwork in Africa, in Mexico, in the West Indies, throughout the western U.S., but he is most known, I think, for his passion for bringing science to conservation, for essentially being one of the founders of the Society of Conservation Biology. Michael has published 9 books, more than 170 papers, including papers in Science and Nature. And Michael has amazing commitment. And what I mean by that is he was on the faculty at University of Michigan. He left. He became a Zen Buddhist working in LA, and he had a koan, a visionary experience. What should be next in my life? And he wasn't sure what it would be. And so unemployed, he went back to the University of California at San Diego, where some of his students and postdocs were, and he slept in the lab for a while to figure it out. And if more people were more committed to conservation the way Michael is, I'm sure our world would be better. Michael Soule.
Thank you. It's good to be back in the land of the grizzlies. We've got deer and elk and bobcats and coyotes, but we don't have, in Colorado, I live in Colorado, we don't have the big actors, and it's nice to be here. I want to thank, before I begin my talk, I want to thank a number of people who contributed at various stages to what I'm talking about, which is a possible national campaign. Kenyon Fields, Kim Vicario of the Wildlands Project, Christina Eisenberg, and Paul Valdick of the High Lonesome Ranch in Quebec, Colorado, Keith Bowers of the Wildlands Project, and Mary Ellen Hannibal, Daniel Press from UC Santa Cruz, Brian Miller, Margot McKnight, who am I leaving out? I'll think of it in a little while. And also the Wilberforce Foundation in particular for contributing financially to some of the projects that I'll be mentioning. I'm not showing any PowerPoint slides. And I tried it, but I didn't like it. So that's the good news. And I won't be reading any PowerPoint slides either. That's also good news. Okay. I want to begin by asking a question. What have conservation biologists and conservationists contributed to conservation in the past several decades? And the answer is a hell of a lot. The good news is that much has been accomplished, including, thanks to Bill McKibben recently, Obama's tentative decision to tentatively postpone the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada, bringing totally dirty crude oil down through the United States to the Gulf Coast, which would seriously contribute to greenhouse warming. But this incident and Bill McKibben's involvement in it is a reminder of something Bruce Babbitt told us, conservationists and conservation biologists, in the early years of the Clinton administration. He said that don't wait for us to do the right things. Make us do the right things. And that's still a potent lesson, and that's what Bill McKibben was doing. He started this, he wasn't the only one, but contributed greatly to this campaign to stop that pipeline. And it takes activism, it takes getting off our butts to do stuff like that. Also, other good things have happened thanks to our work over the decades. Landmark laws have been passed, starting mostly in the 70s, such as the Wilderness Act, and the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act, and the National Forest Management Act, and NEPA, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. This was an era of progressive environmental legislation, and it ended in the 1980s. And there have been virtually no major progressive legislative acts since then. But there have been a lot of wilderness areas designated since then, and most recently a lot of marine parks are starting to be designated. It's less controversial to do it offshore, of course, than it is to do it on, within the lower 48 or all the 50 states. And thanks to conservation NGOs, many areas and millions of acres have been protected from devastation, and some of the wounds from the past have been mitigated. And many government employees have bravely fought against the pressures from above, the political pressures, and have helped slow the losses on public lands, though many, of course, have been muzzled and fired and transferred because of their activism and integrity. I want to thank those people. I think we all should applaud those people, if there are any here. I need to confess some things. I've over the last year or so, I realized that I've suffered from some major delusions that have affected me and the progress of organizations I've been involved with. And some of you won't agree with them, but that's okay. I recently awoke from a 40-year hypnotic state, a trance. I call it the public lands delusion. I've been in denial or deluded about the reality of the West for decades, and I just really actually woke up about a year or two ago. It started when I started coming to Colorado to go to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab with Paul Ehrlich as a graduate student in 1962. And I fell in love with the West. I was doing field experiments, and then I moved to Colorado in about 1996. I didn't think I would break up about that. Anyway, the problem was that I was hypnotized by the West, by the wide open horizon-to-horizon spaces that we call public lands. And I was struck by their potential for conservation. I'd always assumed that we were blessed in the West because nearly half of the land was public land, and sometimes 70% in states like Utah and Idaho and Nevada, or 60% at least, was in a public trust, a public estate. It means it was our land, in theory. I now believe that except for some national parks, particularly the ones in this region, Teton Glacier and Yellowstone, our optimism about the conservation potential of public lands for nature protection has been misplaced. It was a hypothesis, but we forgot to test it. We just assumed it was true, that all of this open space in the West was available for conservation. So maybe Wallace Stegner's Western landscape, what he called the geography of hope, is not as hopeful as we thought. I've always assumed that these public lands provided ample room for people and wildlife, but I was wrong. Now I understand that BLM and Forest Service lands will not be the salvation of wildness and biodiversity in the West. Why? Because federal land managers for decades have been told by their bosses in Washington, D.C., that the priorities are political and economic on public lands, not wildlife, not biodiversity, especially not wolves and endangered species. Anyway, I was still memorized by the glorious Western landscape, but in denial about the socio-political landscape. True, we're extraordinarily lucky in Utah and Wyoming and Montana and Idaho and Colorado and Nevada and New Mexico and Arizona. We live in a glorious place. All we have to do is gaze out across the Walmart and Home Depot parking lots and to see the red mesas and the snow-capped blue mountains and buttes, the wide expanses of polychrome plateaus and deserts and grasslands. This is a wide open country still. There's a lot of beauty and grandeur in it. It was enough to make us rub our hands together and say, oh boy, if we were conservationists. But I contend that it's no longer prudent to remain entranced and optimistic about BLM and Forest Service lands. I think we need to take a closer, more agnostic look. The first question that an ecologist or a naturalist must always ask when they go to a place is, what's missing from this picture? It's always a good practice to begin any ecological study or survey or experiment by asking, what's missing in this landscape? What critical cogs and wheels of the wild, of species, what critical species are not there but ought to be there, and by their absence are having some kind of an impact? I remember the first time I went to Maui, and later to Oahu and to some extent the Big Island, I was first of all struck by the beauty, but then realized that the birds and the plants and even the invertebrates were all exotic species. Almost every single one was not native. It's shockingly similar here, although we don't think about it as much, and it's not as extreme, of course. Because in Hawaii, half the native bird species that were there 200 years ago are already extinct, and many of the rest are endangered or threatened with extinction. But what's missing from most of our BLM and Forest Service lands? This area is exceptional, I must admit, and I'm grateful. It's true. You still have virtually the complete set of keystone species, particularly the large carnivores. But it's only here in the Rocky Mountains and within the U.S. Of course, the Canadian Rockies have the full complement still in many places, at least in the mountains. But if you go to 90% of the BLM and Forest Service lands in the Rocky Mountain region, in the area we call the spine of the continent, you don't see them. You don't see the keystone species. You don't see grizzlies and wolverines. You don't see the wolf, the supreme guardian of wildlands in the West. Fortunately, grizzlies and wolves keep trying here in this region to get a foothold, which I'm very happy about. Go Grizz. But as I said, on 90% of Forest Service and BLM lands, you'll never see many of the animals that were once abundant, like badgers and burrowing owls and boreal toads and bison, wild bison. and bull trout and wolverines and lynx. Increasingly, the same applies to prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets. Are these disappearances from public lands in the West just random or temporary? Ideally, there would be plans to return these disappeared species from most of the West, most other public lands in the West. But this would require a revolution in public lands management policies. I no longer believe what I used to believe, that the next administration will change the rules and policies. It's always the next administration. I doubt that the revolution on public lands is happening. Realistically, these missing interactive species will not be restored in the spine of the continent on public lands, most public lands in my lifetime, and probably not in yours, at least to ecologically effective densities. To borrow from the Cohn brothers, the public lands of the West are no country for old endangered species, particularly for so-called varmints and vermin, like wolves and bison, prairie dogs and rattlesnakes. Most BLM areas are ecological sinks for large carnivores. Why is that? It's because anybody can do anything, anytime, with any tool or weapon on BLM and U.S. Forest Service lands they want. And with the defunding of the land management agencies by Congress, there is now little money for enforcement of laws on public lands. So there's hardly any fear among people of consequences of their illegal actions on public lands. And to top it all off, the recent decision by Congress, which your senator helped with, to delist the wolf based on politics and not science, is a scandal and is simply official anarchy. There, I said it. So it's true, some elements of the original American biota, though, have prospered on public lands. Deer and elk are now plentiful, probably more plentiful than they were since Lewis and Clark came through. Perhaps this is but Leopold's summary about deer was, of course, and still is appropriate. I now suspect that just as deer live in mortal fear of the wolves, so does the mountain live in mortal fear of the deer. Perhaps this is the hidden meaning of the wolf, long known among the mountains, but seldom perceived among men. Leopold understood why deer and elk populations erupted in the West, and all of them, and later in the Midwest and most of the East in the 20th century. It's simple. It was the policy. It was public lands policy, and to some extent private lands policy, pushed through by hunters and natural resource agencies. The policy was and still is to remove as many predators as possible. And the policy really hasn't changed in the last 60 years, as we're seeing back in this area now. This campaign of predator extirpation was accompanied by a subtle shift in management philosophy, in agency philosophy, a kind of mission drift. Also this, when I was a graduate student back in the 60s, colleges and departments of natural resources and fish and game agencies, like the ones in Montana, all taught that the job of natural resources professionals was protecting the resource, including wildlife. Nowadays, however, we rarely hear agency folks talk about protecting the resource. It's not their job anymore. Now the mission of natural resource agencies is to facilitate economic growth, including destructive forms of recreation like ATVs and other thrill craft, particularly the exploitation of commodities of various kinds. In addition, agency managers are often paralyzed by the culture wars, the polarization of values in our culture. This is one reason why I can't believe any longer that Congress or the administration in the foreseeable future will have the courage to truly reform the public lands management agencies. So that was my first delusion, that we could count on public lands to restore, rewild North America. Not for the duration. I had two other delusions. One is that other government institutions will protect biodiversity. Well, I don't believe that anymore either. I don't believe that government institutions like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the courts aren't as bad as some, Congress certainly not, and the administration, which will do anything they can to get reelected, I mean any administration, I don't believe they can change given the highly polarized nature of politics in this country. Even the most impressive political victories achieved by the conservation community in the past 40 years are being strangled by the arms of the federal government, usually for funding. And this is being, of course, pushed on our government by lobbyists with corporate interests. We cannot assume that the political pendulum will swing back in the near future. So we have to do things ourselves. It doesn't mean it won't happen, it's just we have to change tactics. Anyway, the belief that the courts, the Fish and Wildlife Service, or the Montana or Colorado Departments of Natural Resources will vigorously support initiatives like Yellowstone to Yukon or the Spine of the Continent is to indulge in magical thinking. Wallace Stegner rebuked the Forest Service 30 years ago in his Introduction to Wilderness letter. He said, the Forest Service in particular has shown its reluctance and foot dragging that often puts resource use above protection. Its proposed wilderness areas have consistently been minimal. Stegner added that federal bureaus are imperfect human institutions, as all human institutions are, and have sins to answer for and are forced to act as agents of powerful interests. This seems like a mild rebuke today. Government agencies will not change until the revolution happens. But thanks to the Occupy Wall Street movement, we can at least whisper that word again. It kind of feels good, like the 60s. My third and last delusion is that traditional funders of conservation, the big foundations like Doris Duke and Hewlett and Packard and Gordon and Betty Moore, Rockefeller and Hewlett, will step up to the plate and fund visionary conservation projects in the U.S. You know, they do that in developing countries. They fund amazing programs, visionary programs, courageous in developing countries, where you can get anything done with a bribe. You can get a lot of things done with a bribe in this country, but you can't get anything done. So I don't think the foundations have the guts anymore to fund anything that is controversial, that will upset donors and major corporations. We went to the foundations with an idea similar to the one I'm talking about today, about 5 years ago, the big ones, and we asked them, what can we do to get the funding to make the spine of the continent real and make it happen on the ground? And they said, well, first you need a really good strategic plan. So we said, well, what's that? So they said, well, you have to have focus groups, and you have to talk to all the people who like you and all the people who don't like you and get their opinions and compile all that information and put it in a very glossy package with lots of pretty pictures. And we said, okay, we'll do anything it takes. So we made it. We spent $50,000 on a nice strategic plan. And we took it back to the foundations, and they said, well, our mission's changed, or something like that. So that didn't work. So maybe other sectors in society have the guts and motivation to take risks, to be entrepreneurial. A little more on this later. But the point is that first I believed that public lands were the salvation of biodiversity, and then I thought that government agencies like Congress would step up, and then I thought, well, the foundations will step up. None of those turned out to be true. So we're left to our own devices, which is probably where we should have started anyway. Shifting gears, what can we do? I think the first step is to remind ourselves of the major conservation challenges that we have in the West. You know these: invasive species, overgrazing, sprawl, the absence of trophic cascades, which is a major cause globally of extinction, but it's never listed as one of the major causes, the absence of apex predators. The fossil fuel frenzy happening on our public lands, and of course, habitat fragmentation and climate change. So is there any hope in dealing with these? Yes, I think there is. I think there's a lot of hope. The good news is that we already have a solution for some of these problems. It's really simple and cheap. It's a cure for at least 3 of these current ailments, particularly the missing apex predators and trophic cascades, the habitat loss and fragmentation, and climate change. I call this solution nature's aspirin. You know, aspirin is a first responder drug. It's a miracle drug. It does all sorts of great things. It's cheap, as I said. It's an analgesic, an antipyretic, an anticoagulant, and aspirin is a prophylactic agent preventing coronary infarctions and colon cancer. So what is nature's aspirin? There's 3 hints. It's a potent and cheap remedy for ecological decapitation, which is the removal of large carnivores, for disappearing apex predators. It's also a drug that can suture severed parts of the landscape back together and treat fragmentation, and it treats the serious wounds of climate change. Of course, you know what it is. It's connection. It's connectivity. Nature's aspirin is connectivity. It facilitates transport. Continuing the medical metaphor for a moment longer, connectivity is a habitat prosthesis, restoring function by restoring landscape linkages with wildlife corridors and safe migratory pathways like the path of the pronghorn. And it facilitates shifts in the distributions of geographic distributions of flora and fauna, thus allowing creatures to adapt to a climatically altered world. You know, already 80% of species globally are on the move due to shifts in climate and shifts in bioclimatic zones and variability in climate. So nature's aspirin is all about movement, about improving landscape permeability for creatures. Movement is critical. Movement is the sign of life on most planets, I think. Our creatures need to migrate. They need to disperse. They need to forage. They need to reproduce and move to areas where they breed and where they den and where they birth their young. And creatures need to be able to change their geographic ranges as necessitated by changing climate. So how can we realize our goal of applying our vision of restored extensive connectivity? How do we create what the foundations won't do, what the agencies won't do, and what government won't do? The answer is we can actually, I think, create a continental network of on-the-ground linkages, secure, semi-wild places. We can reconnect, re-knit back together our landscape. I don't believe it's that hard. And I believe that we can design and execute a compelling corridor campaign, not just marketing the idea of connectivity, but actually making it happen, a campaign that will restore movement, inspire the nation, appeal to our values of freedom and destiny, and motivate a mass movement. why must we do this? Why must we create a connectivity campaign? There are two reasons. First, it addresses several national priorities, including the administration's America's great outdoor goals of getting people outside, shaking off extra pounds, dealing with the obesity problem. And it will also create opportunities for outdoor education, and particularly for recreation, fishing, hiking, climbing. People will say in 10 years, have you hiked the Great American Corridor yet? And it will be a place where people can once again have heroic adventures. I mean, you can still have heroic adventures. You can go to South America, you can go to Africa, you can go on treks in this country too, but you can't walk across the continent on land, on semi-wild land, from the north to the south, or the south to the north. What are some of the elements of a National Corridors campaign? Well, I just have a few minutes to talk about that, and it's a very complex issue and one that's going to require several years of study and planning. But we have, I think, the outline, the skeleton of how that campaign would work. First of all, we have to rely on, and we should have been relying much more on private lands conservation and private lands connectivity. I think many of us have ignored, at least I have, the potential for private lands for too long. I believe that private ranch lands and some sovereign Indian lands, tribal lands, will offer more opportunities than most public lands will in achieving in the foreseeable future the rewilding of the backcountry, the restoring of abused wildlands, and reconnecting landscapes and mountain ranges throughout the spine of the continent. For example, many private working ranches and conservation ranches sit astride low elevation valleys, which are critical bridges allowing animals to move from one mountain range to another. So many private lands can function as important linkages connecting national parks and monuments, wilderness areas, and roadless areas. Private lands are also key to any effective conservation in the West because they can provide connectivity for wildlife throughout the entire spine of the continent or Yellowstone to Yukon region. They provide winter refuge for prey and other wildlife. Private lands provide arable, fertile soils and greater biodiversity than most public lands because of moderate climates and better water. They have more aquatic and riparian habitat, and most importantly, they provide something public lands won't provide for a long time: safety and security for carnivores, for wildlife in general. There are thousands, literally thousands, of landowners in the West who aspire to create economically viable mixed-use properties and ranches while contributing to a larger landscape goal. There's much more idealism in private landowners than I thought. I think a silent majority of private landowners would be on board with this issue, and in part because increasingly, due to the disparity of incomes, many large properties and ranches in the West are owned by wealthy landowners who don't need to have large herds of cattle on them. Wildlands Network is working to organize networks of willing entrepreneurial landowners, many of which are already restoring and reconnecting and rewilding their ranches. Last July, Wildlands Network and the High Lonesome Ranch in Colorado convened a meeting of 25 committed landowners and ranch managers from all over the West. Steering that initiative were Kenyon Fields and other folks from Wildlands, Paul Valdick, the owner of the High Lonesome Ranch, and Christina Eisenberg from the High Lonesome Ranch, and other folks like Hal Salwasser, who some of you know, from Oregon State University, and I think a lot of you probably know Monique DeGiorgio and Mike Phillips of the Turner Endangered fund, they were there. And in 2012, we're having follow-up meetings at the High Lonesome Ranch and the Turner Vermejo Ranch. The goals and principles that are being drafted by the landowners themselves are being seriously discussed and edited right now. But they include the acceptance of predators and the restoration of rangelands and riparian areas, the reintroduction of missing native species of wildlife, and the goal of registering 5 to 10 million acres of privately owned lands in this partnership in the next 1 to 3 years. The surprising thing to everybody there was the passion and excitement and commitment of these private ranch owners and managers to this idea. We were totally surprised by the enthusiasm for the idea of allowing predators back on these huge areas of private lands in the West. There are similar complementary movements going on in the Southwest and elsewhere. Another element, besides the private lands element, is ecological restoration. One of the first parts of any campaign, once it's underway, to restore nature in the West will be massive restoration projects, all the way from Mexico to Canada, to restoring landscape permeability and to create wildlife buffers and refugia and restore habitat throughout this area that will benefit not only wildlife, but hugely benefit local communities all along the way, rural communities, because of jobs. Where will the money come from? I think it'll come. I think this idea will catch on, but I'm a dreamer. An early stage in this process will be surveying candidate corridor routes by professionals in ecological restoration and in climate change adaptation. Because a lot of the challenges that will be in the future will be facilitating the movement of flora and fauna as climate regimes change. But this also will create a lot of jobs, particularly in the construction sector. Environmentalists and conservationists must lobby also for the revision of tax laws that provide incentives, that will provide incentives for conservation of habitat and wildlife on private lands. A corridors bill has also been drafted, but I don't think the timing is propitious for that kind of conservation legislation, but it will happen someday. Public lands protection, in spite of my earlier comments, must also be part of this, obviously. Notwithstanding the current degradation on many public lands, we have to continually pressure agencies and government for improving management practices on public lands, and to bring management on public lands into conformity with life-affirming values and a land ethic, which we've forgotten about, and with science. Well, how do we measure success of a conservation corridor campaign, a national corridor campaign, which, by the way, won't only be in the spine of the continent? As I mentioned in a minute or so, there's already a big movement on the East Coast, up and down, from the Florida Keys up to Canada, for a similar campaign there. How do we measure success? Well, necessarily, a victory from a conservation perspective means protection on the ground of connected lands in quasi-perpetuity along a route that provides sufficient habitat and security for viable and ecologically effective populations and ecological functions provided by critical species. That's a mouthful. But in other words, the biology is a big part of it, but I think a bigger part of this will be viability for rural communities, viability for businesses, viability for educational institutions, and for the very big recreational industry in the United States. I think if we want to succeed in the 21st century, our goals must appeal to majority values and concerns. They must be attractive across the political spectrum. The time has passed when a national biodiversity or corridor campaign of this scale can be sold to the public because it extends the ranges of wolves and prairie dogs. So I believe that success depends on messages of hope. These messages must promise economic opportunities for local and regional businesses, expanded and inspiring recreational venues, tourism benefiting rural communities and businesses, and trout fishing for Sanjan and Kevin, if they're here. I don't know if you know Sanjan and Kevin, but they're fanatic trout fishermen. But that's a metaphor for a lot more fishing opportunities. Ecological restoration benefiting people, and marketing opportunities for companies producing and selling tourism and outdoor clothing and gear, like REI and Patagonia. And the corridors also need to provide experiential outdoor nature and science education for millions of American children across all classes, demographics, and regions. Also, there are already existing trails corridors, but we need a lot more extensive kinds of recreational facilities from Mexico to Canada. Non-motorized backcountry access and mobility for equestrian trails, mountain bike trails, ski trails in relatively wild country from Mexico to Canada. I've mentioned job creation, and some of those jobs will be in the creation of hut systems up and down the spine of the continent and the other corridors to facilitate people walking the entire length of the corridors if they want to, or at least in sections of them, and campgrounds and educational facilities for the millions of children that need to be brought out of the schools. It must also appeal to business leaders, to county commissioners, to chambers of commerce, and educators across the entire spectrum, K through 15. Is there also room for nature? Well, I've said before that some of the goals are about biodiversity, wildlife linkages. But again, those may be my goals, some of those may be many of your goals, but they're not the goals of the majority of the people in this country, of the rural Westerners. But I think it's possible to have a corridor system that provides wildlife what it needs, but also people and industry and corporations with what they need. In summary, a national corridor campaign can revitalize the West with adventure and challenge, with science education, ecological restoration, rural economic renewal and prosperity, adaptation to climate change and protection of biodiversity, and health and happiness of people. It's necessary because vision without execution is just daydreaming. We have to execute. I'm not talking about anybody in particular. The first editor of Wild Earth magazine, John Davis, just finished 2 days ago this amazing travel called Trek East, under the auspices of Wildlands, but several other organizations. National Geographic was marginally involved too, where he canoed, biked, walked, and paddled all the way from the Florida Keys to the Gaspe Peninsula, over 7,000 miles in about 3 or 4 months, in order to popularize the idea of connectivity up and down the Atlantic coast, up and down the Appalachians and Adirondacks, up into Canada. It got a lot of publicity. But the good news for us is he's coming out here next. And in 2013, John will do Trek West from, we don't know from where to where, but certainly from Canada to Mexico at least. And that will be very exciting. And a lot of you, I hope, will be involved in that. There'll be plenty of opportunity for engagement and for providing support. A lot of media attention. will come to that, much more than came to Trek East, because the West is the magic place for wilderness and for the wild. So tune in and show up. So it really only matters that we act as if all the beauty in the world were hanging by a thread, which it is. But that thread can become a string, and that string can become a cord, and that cord can become ropes, and those ropes can be bridges across America. Thank you. Of course, I've been asked to take some questions. Unless a speaker goes way too long, they're always asked to take questions. Yes?
You talked a lot about apex predators. And, I watched 20 years ago when Fish and Wildlife Service hired wolf recovery coordinators and watched them over the course of a decade slowly build trust among the grazing community and private landowners that yes, some given number of wolves would not only be okay, but perhaps even be a good thing. That was built largely on the kind of promise that when recovery goals were met, those populations would be capped through various means. Watching through our clients in Wyoming and Montana the last 5 years, I've watched that trust be shot in the ass by court challenges. And I guess, you know, as much as an advocate as I am for having apex predators in the system, it seems like we need to be conscious of the political reality in dealing with landowners and other constituents. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, a lot. I have a lot of thoughts on the problem with wolves and other apex predators. It's interesting, though, that, you know, those animals are vagal. They like to move around, particularly wolves, but even the grizzly bears are moving out into the eastern part of Montana now. People don't hate bears as much as they hate wolves, but you know, it's going to take another generation, but it will happen. You know, we have time. As long as we have the land and the habitat, we don't have to get wolves all back into the West in 5 years. I don't really care how long it takes. And I think the politics are changing. Certainly 70% of people polled in the West favor wolves, but they don't all carry guns into the forests. And a lot of the wolves in New Mexico and in this part of the country are just being shot and buried. And the same will happen for a long time, but not forever. So I think we just need to be patient, and it will take time, and there will be ups and downs. But gradually, particularly if we can bring lots of kids out here to the West and educate them about science and natural history, the chances will improve. And I think it's one of the major reasons for a National Corridors campaign, which supports major educational initiatives, because kids aren't being taught science anymore. And kids aren't being exposed to nature anymore. You know, you've heard about nature deficit disorder and all that. Well, that's one of the major functions of a national corridor, which is to reintroduce our children to nature. Now, that's just one of the many functions. So I'm not, in the short term, it looks pretty grim, I admit, for wolves. But in the long term, I think we will become a civilized country. Any other questions? Yes.
In the West, you have a lot of indigenous groups, so I wanted to know how you see them in this idea of building this corridor.
What was the beginning of your question?
That in the West
In the
of the U.S., you have a lot of indigenous
Yes.
groups, and they have their land also. So how you see them as partners in this?
Yes, I think a lot of the progress will be made on sovereign tribal lands. in the first 10 years or so. A lot of the tribes really love wildlife. They have a spiritual connection to the land and to wildlife. Some tribes don't, but the ones up in the Northwest generally do. So I think we'll make a lot of progress, not on public lands, but on sovereign Indian lands. And it depends, you know. Our indigenous people aren't any different than anybody else in the world in the sense that there's always conservatives in a tribe and radicals in a tribe. There's conservationists in a tribe and people only interested in casinos in the tribes. So they're just as diverse as any other group in the society. But there's enough Native Americans in Canada and the U.S. that support this vision. So I think there will be a lot of progress made on these lands. And as a complement to other non-federal lands. But I'm an optimist sometimes. Yeah.
I'm a wildlife historian and I'm working on a history of wildlife out of Yellowstone. And I'm wondering what you see as the future for the bison coming out of Yellowstone area.
I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball about bison rewilding and in the West. But I think, again, over time, more ranchers are becoming interested in bison. It's a niche market for its meat, for one thing. And but there's a lot of prejudice. A lot of people in the West think that you can't fence bison in. Well, it depends on how those buffalo are raised. There are bison that are trained to fences when they're young, so they don't break through them habitually. And it's certainly true that the older males are more likely to just go rampaging around. So, but there are ways to manage bison, and I know I worked on a ranch in New Mexico, the Wind River Ranch, and for a while, and there were bison. They stayed in the fences. There's about 5,000 acres. They always stayed in the fences. But when people drove by on the highway, they stopped. They were fascinated. I mean, it's the only large Pleistocene mammal we have, except for the predators. So, and they always attract a lot of attention. So I'm optimistic, not because of the curiosity factor, but I think because of the economic factors for tourism and for meat and other commodities, that bison will return slowly. We're considering putting them back on the High Lonesome Ranch in Colorado. They're on lots of ranches in Colorado. Whether or not they'll be allowed to roam free on the national grasslands in eastern Colorado, I don't know. But the time may come. Little by little, as my teacher used to say. Any others? Yes, Scott.
So Michael, I take my class over to eastern Montana every fall to the black-footed ferret recovery programs. And of course, right now in eastern Montana, the American Prairie Foundation and World Wildlife Fund are working on bison reintroduction, among other things. And it was interesting in talking to the ranchers there, the local landowners, the two biggest concerns that ranchers had were, number one, that managing for connectivity of something like bison would impinge on their ability to raise cattle in traditional ways. Then the other issue, though, that you didn't mention, you mentioned fishing in your vision but not hunting. The other concern among a lot of the local communities in the East is that somehow this is a sneak move to set up refuges that would not allow for hunting on public lands and on the corridor or the APF lands. Now, this is counter to what the APF people, the folks that are initiating this are saying, but there's just this very deep distrust that hunting would be disallowed. And so I wonder, in your vision, how you would address that, whether it's right or wrong, that sort of perception that hunting would be prohibited.
Well, that's certainly not anybody's intention in my organization, Wildlands Network. It's not mine. I'm a hunter. I think a lot of people like to hunt bison. So that's another use for them. I mean, it's kind of like hunting a barn door. But if you like it, to each his own. So I don't think hunting is going to be an issue in this campaign. These corridors will probably only be a few miles wide to accommodate equestrian trails and mountain bike trails and hikers and trekkers and wildlife areas. So there probably won't be a lot of hunting within these corridors, which are going to be relatively narrow. But it will provide access to hunting lands outside of the corridors. That's something we haven't even really dealt with at all yet. I mean, I like to go into the mountains and hunt, but I don't have to go into a wildlife corridor to do it.
As moderator, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask one last question, and then we'll start the talks at 2 o'clock. Michael, what kind of advice do you have for a graduate student aspiring to make a career in conservation biology?
Don't be afraid to be different. I don't think there's as much future in conservation biology as I think there is in conservation. But to be a conservationist, if you're trained as a scientist, it's a hard change for some people. But there's a lot of people now who are stepping across the boundary between conservation and conservation biology. So I think there will be increasing opportunities there. But there's also a fear of those in academia that they won't be looked on as rigorous enough or pure enough scientists. That will always be a problem in academia. But fortunately, more and more conservation biologists are not in academia. They're working for nonprofits and for governments. I don't know if I knew what was going to happen to the Society for Conservation Biology when I helped to start it in 1985 or 86, I wouldn't have done it. Because I think the soul has gone out of it. Reading the current issues of conservation biology, to me, is pretty demoralizing. It's all about mitigating and slowing the rates of extinction and destruction. There's no element of passion and fire in the belly of the journals written. I suppose it wouldn't get past the reviewers if they were too wild.
And I will invite and mention that at 7 o'clock tonight, there's a panel in which Michael will present some of his thoughts, and a distinguished series of his students, ex-students, will be doing theirs. But at this point, I've been instructed to say we should take a 2-minute break for some people who may want to shuffle out or hit the restroom, and we'll start in about 2 minutes with the regular scheduled speakers. Thank you, Michael.